Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to come here, because it's a pleasure for me to see young people and to know that they are interested in World War II. I've seen your projects, I've seen the pictures that you've drawn and the poems that you've written about this celebration of the end of World War I. In 1918, that was the beginning of this celebration, Remembrance Day. And since World War II, which was joined as well, it's in memory of all the people that fought and were maybe killed or wounded during World War I and then World War II. And since World War II, unfortunately, in some of your countries, I heard Croatia, one of the girls is from Croatia, that there were many wars. The Malvins, there were wars in Iraq, etc. So that now this celebration, well, it's Remembrance Day. It's not a big celebration because we're thinking of the people that died mostly, that gave their lives for freedom, that gave their lives, that your parents are here, live, you are alive today. It's thanks to the people that fought in those wars, that you still are happy and free, let's say. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born, I'm British, as you know, you've heard. I was born in a seaside town quite near London, 40 miles from London. This is called the mouth of the River Thames. Oni po slovensky ústy, Temže. To ste počuli? Ústy. Ústy je keď končí rieka a ide k mori. It's the end of a long river, well, the River Thames you've all heard about, and where it comes out to the sea. And that is called the mouth of the river. So that is where I was born, the River Thames practically. In 1939, I was a schoolgirl, like you, just a young girl of 12, and I was evacuated. Now, during your lessons, I think about World War II, you've learnt about the evacuation. That meant that all young people or families, a mother with children, they were evacuated from the part near London and round the coast of the British Isles to the east coast. We were evacuated to inside the country or to the west side of the Great Britain or to Scotland there. So that we were taken into other people's homes, or I was lucky I had grandparents in Scotland, and so I went to stay with my grandparents. And shortly after one term at a Scottish school, I was sent to a boarding school. You know what is a boarding school? Yeah. Where you sleep and eat, and there were only girls there. You're lucky you've got boys and girls. Hope you don't fight together. No, are you all friends? Or are you sometimes fighting? Or squabbling, maybe. Yeah, well, that's healthy. If it's not wild, then it's healthy, isn't it? Yeah, that's part of life there. So I was at this boarding school, and my favourite occupation was sports. I loved sports. And the wee girls, we played cricket, played netball, we could go riding or swimming, it depended. But my favourite sport was hockey. Yes, ground hockey. Pozemny hockey. I liked that very much, and tennis, of course. In 1943, I did my school leaving exams, my levels, and then I became a student of pharmacy. You know what is pharmacy? Yes, you've heard of that. I wanted to be a nurse, so I joined the Red Cross. In 1943, I was a young girl of 16. So I became a nurse at the hospital, but only on Saturdays and Sundays, because I was a voluntary nurse. I wasn't a nurse that was every day in the hospital. I was studying pharmacy. And every Saturday and Sunday, I would go for 4 to 8 hours to the hospital. And on many occasions, we had people that had been bombed and injured during the bombing in Great Britain, in that area where I lived. And then we had people like German pilots that had been shot down mostly had been shot down into the River Thames or onto land. And if they were wounded, the British people took them to a hospital. If there was a military hospital, then they went to a military hospital, but everywhere weren't military hospitals. And they went to the normal general hospital in the area where they had been found or been shot down. So that I helped these people, particularly, as I mentioned, the German airmen that had been shot down and wounded, by writing Red Cross postcards that went to Switzerland, because Switzerland is the base of the Red Cross. You know, the Swiss flag is a white cross on a red background, and the Red Cross is the reverse of the Swiss cross, yes? It's a white background with the Red Cross on it. So all the letters saying that people have been found or wounded that were like enemies to Great Britain, their letter or postcard, many I've written, went to Switzerland, and from Switzerland it went to their home countries, wherever they came from, even from Czechoslovakia. Some people got Red Cross letters or postcards. It was usually a postcard. And in particular, I remember one young pilot, and he didn't want to speak English. And I didn't want to speak German. In fact, I didn't know much German. A little French I had at school, but German not. And he wouldn't tell me his name. He wouldn't tell me anything about him. And I told him, look, if you don't tell me your parents or your brothers and sisters, they won't know that you're alive, that you're out of the war now, you can relax, and you'll be a prisoner of war. Go to a camp when you recover. And eventually, the doctors were very happy because I was able then to communicate with him, and he did speak English, but he didn't want to speak English. He was afraid he'll give information away that would affect his fellow pilots or airmen back in Germany, that he'd given information to the British. But we told him, no, we need to have your information so that we can help you. And he was satisfied in the end. No, maybe it was because I was a young girl and maybe quite pretty, and that I managed to persuade him. He was young as well, about 20, so that was good. Another thing I want to tell you, during the war, the role that women played in the war. Now, we had the land army, where women that had been maybe living or brought up on farms, they became members of the land army. Now, what was the land army? They were women that were helping the farmers to grow crops and to help the aid for the war, because Britain had to be more or less independent. The things weren't coming to Britain by boat, not very many. From America sometimes we got some meat or something like that from there. But Britain was almost independent, growing its own food during the war, because everything was rationed. You've heard about rations. I think you've done a project, something with ration books and something like that. It's prídel po slovensky, prídel. That everything, you could have so many rolls a day, maybe 2 only. You could only have a week 10 decas of chocolate or sweets. You weren't allowed, you couldn't buy as much as you wanted then. And even fruit was scarce apart from apples. Oranges, bananas, grapes in Britain, they didn't grow. So that wasn't easy to obtain very much. So we know now that there were women in the land army. Then there were girls that were driving buses, or women driving buses and trams, so that the men could go to the army or to the air force or to the navy. You know, Great Britain is famous for its navy. Britannia rules the waves, which is the sea, the waves. You've heard of that, haven't you? There's a famous song as well, isn't it? Then we know that not only were the trams and the buses driven by women and tractors, as I mentioned, in the land army, but we had the women's army, the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Army. Now, I have a paper here, you'll read a little bit something about it. My older sister was in the army. she was a driver in the army, and she also did the mechanical school to learn the components of the lorries and the jeeps and the different things, because she had to repair it, not only drive, but she was repairing the things. Now, maybe you've heard that our Queen, when she was Princess Elizabeth during the war, she's a year older than I am, she also joined the army, and she also did this Remy course, which was to learn the components and how to repair a car, change a wheel, etc. And she did this as well, and she was also driving. Maybe General Petrak told you that he met her. She came to an army camp, and she was driving the NAFI van, which is a van going around the camps, giving the soldiers tea or some cigarettes, selling cigarettes, or a roll or a gemle or something like that. And that's what the Princess Elizabeth did. Princess Margaret was younger.
People in my class, if you remember, there was a newspaper, I'll put it away now, do you remember the picture of the newspaper? Yes. With the picture it says, left hand down a bit, Your Highness. And she decided that she was going to drive big lorries and big tanks, and she was under the car as well. And
yes, repairing.
She did her part.
That is true. Then, as a matter of fact, in all the royal family, you had members of the royal family, the men, the king's brothers, the king's cousins and nephews. Many of them took part in the Air Force. Even the king's younger brother was killed on a flying accident in Britain. So I'll continue about the women. My younger sister, well, it's actually I'm the youngest, but the one between me and my older sister who was in the army. I had another sister, she lives in Holland, and she was in the Women's Air Force. Now, she wasn't flying, of course, she wasn't a pilot or something, but she was very clever at codes. You know what are codes, don't you? And cipher. To cipher something is to translate the da-da-da-da that was coming. There were mobiles in those days, or like today we have the website and computers. During British War, the World War II, there was no such thing. Was everything done by this Morse coding? Da-da-da-da, you know, SOS. Is that three dots and three strokes, etc. So that my sister knew that, and also she knew shorthand, which is kratostenographia. Hey? When someone's dictating a letter or something to you, she just makes signs like newspaper reporters. They're not writing everything I would be saying, but they're just making notes of marks. Yes, this is called shorthand. There, and they can read it, I can't. Anyway, my sister had been at school and that she'd studied, and so in the Air Force this was very good, because before the pilots ran for their planes, if it was a bomber or a fighter, they had not an interview, but they were instructed, yes, you're going over Holland or you're going over France, and you've got this to be bombed, or you've got to accompany the bombing planes, the Hurricanes or the Spitfires, went out to aid or shoot off enemy planes so that the bombing planes could go in and destroy certain projects. And she was the last person, with an officer, of course she wasn't an officer, to give instructions to these pilots before they left for bombing missions, or when they returned, they would tell her who is missing. Yes, only from the left side wing somebody's missing, or they would say their name or the number of the plane. We saw that plane being shot down, falling into the sea, or onto the land and burning, and possibly the crew wasn't able to parachute out, and they are killed. So this was reported. My sister made the reports, and that was passed on to higher commands or to higher officers there. So I've mentioned to you, but also there were women who were in the Navy. Now, these women that were in the Royal Navy, on the seas, on boats, they were really usually doctors or nurses. They weren't just sailors. The other women that were in the Navy were on the land in headquarters, giving instructions to the boats or receiving messages from people going to sea, etc. So women played a very important part in the war. They took the place of men, they were attractive, they were a nice company for the men when they had a little free time. They were friends together, going to the cinema or going dancing or visiting some villages or towns near the airports. So that is also, they had a social life together. So I don't know, have you any questions? Who would like to ask me something? I'll have a little drink of this very nice cup of tea.
Okay, who's got a question then? Yes, Pierre.
Did she go to many countries, or did she stay in...
You ask Ailsa. I don't know.
I stayed in Britain, and I'll tell you why. At the age of 16, I learned to drive. In Great Britain, you were allowed to drive a car or something, but you had to have somebody who was a driver with you, just in case you did something wrong. So my mother was a driver. My mother was in the army, also a driver, but she was a volunteer driver. She didn't get money, but she was driving some officers around, etc. And in my family, we are all very good drivers, I can say. But my father, he was called a backseat driver. He always sat in the back of the car, like he would sit in the back of a taxi. That's a backseat driver.
Who knows what a backseat driver is? Who's been in the car with your dad and he's been sitting in the back and saying, turn right here, do that, don't go too fast. Who's ever done that?
We all know that, don't we?
Well, that's a backseat driver.
Yes.
Okay,
So when I learned to drive, and I was in the Red Cross, which was, you see a picture of me in uniform here. I used to come here in outside uniform, but no, I didn't wear it. When I was in the uniform, I met my husband. He was then a young officer in the Czechoslovak army. He was a parachutist like General Petra. General Petra commanded when they knew each other. And also he was to go to Scotland, but some plans were changed and he was sent to the Soviet Union, to Russia. And he fought in Russia, and between Poland and Slovakia, the Dukla Pass in the Carpathians, and he was also a partisan in the Slovak mountains, fighting for his life and things like that. I wanted to become an ambulance driver, and there was a possibility, I was then 17, getting 18 by this time, and I wanted to be an ambulance driver in the Red Cross and to go to France, because in France the second front had started to free Europe. But my husband, who was then just my boyfriend, he told my mother, no, don't let Ailsa go to France, it's dangerous and something can happen to her. She must stay in Britain, she can be in the Red Cross, she can do her studies, and I will return if I live, he told her. I will return back to Britain after the war and find her. And that's exactly what happened. And that's how I eventually got to Slovakia, or to Czechoslovakia.
Okay,
Just 1 minute, I beg your pardon.
So it means you speak just English and Slovak?
I speak English and Slovak, yes. I knew French, but I've forgotten it. I didn't keep it up. And you have French, haven't you? Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. Before we just carry on, is there anybody in Miss Mariana's English group? Okay, then you need to go to Miss Mariana. Okay, then the rest of you stay here. Just Miss Mariana's group. You know Miss Mariana's group?
So, have a nice English lesson.
Ask Miss Mariana. Right, now the rest of you can move forward. And here. And those people on the chairs, if you're a bit flush, you can move on to there. Okay.
Are you from India or from Pakistan?
India.
Yes, very nice. And what part of India do you come from?
I can feel enough.
Yes. You know that in India, I mean, you were part of Britain, no? Very nice.
Right, Alex, you had a question.
No, why do you know Slovak? Speaks in Slovak.
I beg your pardon? Why do I speak Slovak, or when do I speak Slovak?
No, not how.
How do I
Who
speak?
taught you? Well,
Nobody taught me. I had to learn because I came to this country, nobody spoke English. So I had to start learning. First I learned Czech because I lived in Prague. And after nearly 1 year, I came to Slovakia. My husband was Slovak. And what to do? I learned to speak Slovak by listening and going to the market shopping. Yes, and so that you had to speak if you wanted to buy something. Things were rationed. It wasn't easy to get the food, so that you had to sort of hackle to get.
Okay, the rest of you put your hands down.
Textbooks at all, or was it literally through speaking and?
No, I never sat and learnt there. I can say maybe when my two sons went to school, where they had to learn, they spoke only English, so they were like 6 years old. And they had to stop speaking English because they went to Slovak school, and they were told at school you mustn't speak English because it wasn't allowed then, you couldn't learn English at school. German and Russian, they were the only two languages until 1953 or 4. Then they started, in Russia they were learning English, and here it wasn't possible. There. So a little bit from hearing my sons who learned English more or less playing with children together by ear, and then going to school, so that a little I picked up. You know, in Slovakia we have the soft I and the ypsilon, the Y.
Yes.
But I really never learnt it, but I have a feeling for it, and if I read something and there's a mistake, because a lot of Slovaks make this mistake as well, I can usually find it, which surprises the Slovaks. How did you manage to do that? And I think they just feel it. Yeah. Yeah, please, you want.
Okay.
You said that you were like on the standing with the.
Working in the hospital.
Yes.
Yes.
As a volunteer.
As a volunteer nurse.
Yes.
Yes. I'll show you a picture. Yes, I know I have.
Wasn't that job showing
Do you have a picture?
Yes, I know I have the picture. That's a big picture. Where is it? Oh, it's over here.
It'll be here.
Yeah,
Okay, there we are.
yeah.
Can you sit down? Maybe you can show them. Perhaps I can
So
pass this
here
round.
you can see you can sort of show it around.
Okay, if I show you, if I walk around with it, you can see there's Ailsa. There's Ailsa working in her Red Cross uniform. Okay? If I show you, if I pass it round,
That's during the war, 1944.
right? Let's not touch it. Careful. Because of course, photographs like this are very precious, aren't they? You know, this is your.
You can go there.
If I go this way,
And
sorry.
there you can see
I can show you.
2 or 3 years
Ailsa
ago
in
by the
her
monument
Red
in
Cross
Chapel
uniform,
Bernard.
British Red Cross. They were the nurses, they were the volunteers. Yeah?
That's here in Bratislava. You go there to the monument. Yes. On
Yeah,
Sunday.
you see it? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry? Pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's Ailsa in her Red Cross.
This is visiting in the
Ailsa
centre of
in her
Bratislava,
Red
to the
Cross
monument.
uniform. Okay?
It was a couple of
Okay,
years
so
ago.
she was
But on
handed
Sunday,
us.
every
She
year
was a
again.
volunteer.
It was in civilians.
Alright. That one there.
The copies, see? And there is
Okay. Alright.
Before we continue, I'll just quickly tell you something. This is a picture of my husband before he died, as an elderly man with some of his medals on him.
Is that one of him when he was younger?
The young man, yes, no, then he was maybe 70 something. Plus.
I can tell you, I've seen a photograph of Mr. Doman when he was Alexander, when he was a young man. He was a very, very handsome man. Yes, I will tell you. They were, in fact, they were a very striking pair. Okay? Alright? So,
Yes, so there's my husband, so there you can see. Wherever I go, Prince Charles, he was in my pocket, or he was in my handbag, and now I have the Queen twice, and he was handsome, yes, yes.
So, how did you meet him? Tell them how you met him.
Well, it was really by chance that I met my husband. It was on the 9th of April 1944. The war was at its height. The second front hadn't begun, but it began in June a little later. And my mother had her birthday, and she invited a friend whose mother was my Sunday school teacher, and her daughter was my schoolmate. And they phoned up that they would be late to come to my mother's birthday party because they have two visitors. And one visitor was my future husband and his friend. They were Czechoslovaks in Britain. And so they came to our family, and my husband said to my mother, "I'm Alexander." And I was standing on the stairs from my bedroom looking down into the hall, and he was telling her, "I'm Alexander." And my mother said, "And I'm Alexandrina too." They have the same name, the boy's name and the girl's name. And that was how we first met. And then, of course, we were attracted to each other, but I was still just nearly 17, so that I didn't think he's going back to Czechoslovakia or forget me. His girlfriend's back in Czechoslovakia. So that, but he told me, "You must write to me." So that we were writing, and I wrote many, many letters, and he wrote some letters, but when he went from the Middle East, from Egypt, he got up to Russia to prepare, because he was a parachutist, to come into the Slovak national uprising. You've heard of that, haven't you? That was in the middle of Slovakia, where the Czechoslovaks, or the Slovaks, started to raise arms and to fight oppression, and they wanted freedom, and the people became partisans. So that my husband actually from Russia was coming into Slovakia as an officer, and a very highly trained officer in Great Britain, to help the Slovak free people and to get rid of the enemy out of this country. Yes, please.
You said you lived in the Czech Republic. Where did you live?
In Prague.
Prague. I lived there for 3 years.
Did you? I love Prague. Yes, it's nice. But now this Charles Bridge, it looks awful. They're rebuilding it and it looks terrible.
They shouldn't. It's really beautiful.
Yeah?
I want to ask 2 questions.
Two questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
What did you do after war? Like, what happened?
No, well, after the war again, I was studying pharmacy and I was still working in the hospital. And one evening in September 1945, just after the war, there was a knock at the front door. And I went to open the front door, and there was standing my future husband. Well, I didn't realise that he was going to be my future husband. I had a lot of boyfriends that went to the cinema, to the theatre, to concert, of course, because I wasn't engaged or anything, so that why not? I was a nice young girl, enjoying myself, dancing and going to the cinema, etc. And I said to him, "And where did you come from?" And he said, "I'm in Nuremberg on the war crimes trials." He was sent as a representative of Czechoslovakia from Prague to Nuremberg. And he was there for 4 or 5 months, so that he couldn't really come back to Britain to find me or see me, he knew where I was. But he got 3 days leave and he came over to London, and he came and found me by knocking on the door, and I was saying to him, "Well, where did you come from?" And he said, "I've come to ask you to marry me." And so that was it. Then a little later he came to London. He was the assistant air and military attaché at the embassy in Czechoslovak embassy in London, and then we were able to get married. So that I married after the war, but my husband was in uniform still. And then in 1947, when his duty finished in London, he returned to Prague, and we were living in Prague. And my oldest son was born in Prague.
You then, you want to ask?
Yes, please. No, I have two stripes. You can see them maybe on the uniform there, because I was a section leader. And that meant I had a group of people, under me younger people than I was then about 18, 19. And so that I was responsible that those people will come to their training, they'll take their examinations, that we went on marches, the Victory March, we dressed in our uniforms and went on the Victory March, or if there was some sports competitions or something, we went there to be on duty. But I did things like that, helping people.
Okay, well, next.
Yes?
You were in the you drove the ambulance. So in the D-Day, did you help people who came and got injured in the D-Day?
From the DD landings, I didn't, but I've seen hundreds of people coming, and that was really very sad to see them coming back on the little boat. And the town that I lived in was a seaside town, I mentioned it, but it was also, there was a fishing area. Maybe the gentleman will know, Leigh-on-Sea was famous for cockles and other sea fish that's raked from the sand when the tide goes out. Then these fishermen, local fishermen, are going and collecting these cockles, you know, that are in the shells or shrimps or something like that. And during the DD days, but also when France fell in 1940, these little fishing boats went over from where I lived, which was about 60 miles across to France, not very far. They were going there and picking people up out of the sea. They couldn't get into the beaches, but they were taking people that were on rafts or on blown up little boats or something. And they brought and saved many, many people in the army and brought them back to where I lived. And I've seen that, but I wasn't working in the hospital in 1940, of course. I was at school. Wait a minute, the little boy at the back, because you asked a question.
I have two things to ask. What is your happiest moment during the war?
During the war? Victory. Yes, and that was wonderful, because in the town where I live, there are three towns joined together. It's Leigh-on-Sea, and Westcliff-on-Sea, and Southend-on-Sea, which is a big shopping area, and a lot of people live there. And at Southend-on-Sea, there is a very long pier going out into the water, and the pier is 2 kilometers long, which is, I don't know if you know what is a pier, Tony. It's a mole in Slovak, going out to the water. And it was a very nice place. During the war, the Air Force or the Army were on it, or the Navy, and civilians couldn't go there. But there were many boats coming into this pier because they could be cockpits, because the water was deep at the other end. And so there were American boats, there were British boats coming in, and all these sailors, they got leave because it was victory. And they were all coming into the towns, and they were singing and dancing and chewing gum, which we in Britain we didn't really know very much about chewing gum. And they were very happy, and everyone was dancing in the streets, and we made long chains of people, you know, dancing after each other. We're going all around the streets and around the letterboxes and telephone keys, going around and in the shops, and so that was a wonderful day. But many, many people went to London, to the centre of London, Trafalgar Square. You've seen possibly on the television pictures of that. Hundreds of pictures showing you the people celebrating in Trafalgar Square, which in London is one of the biggest and most important squares, with the column of Nelson on it. And opposite that is the Mall, going down to Buckingham Palace, which is a famous road, the Mall. At the end of the Mall is Queen Victoria's statue and Buckingham Palace. Yes, please. No, another one from you. You're active.
Have you lived through when the Russians came in Slovakia?
Yes.
Perhaps we should let Ailsa sit down and she can tell us about that. So let's keep our questions.
So, I would just say quickly, if you want to have a look at this, I
Okay.
don't know the
Shall
time,
I pass this?
if there's time.
Yes, I think we do
I'll
have time.
let some of these papers
Right,
go
shall I
around.
pass these around?
Yes, you can pass
Th-
it.
th- These are all
Yeah,
that's
this,
right.
you can
Okay,
pass it in
so I have now Ailsa's story, and on the back is her sister. Remember she said her sister, Moira, went to Holland. So if you perhaps share these, maybe one between 2 or 3, right?